Hey everyone, this is Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be looking at the 10 biggest finds for paleontology in 2024. And there's a good spread of different things and different topics to discuss, so let's get into it. It would be remiss of me not to bring up snacks or Sorophagenax, and that's because that was one of the big stories that actually took the online paleo community by storm during 2024. Sorophagenax was named from just a few vertebrae, but there is other material in the quarry it was found in which does pertain to a large theropod. But because of that and the fact that Sorophagenax was initially interpreted as a theropod, all of that material from that quarry has been lumped in together as Sorophagenax. Unfortunately, though, the holotype isn't valid, and that's because the vertebrae in the holotype represent three morphotypes. One of which is from something like Camarasaurus, another one which is from something like Apatosaurus, and the other one is some sort of vague Saurischian, meaning potentially a sauropod or maybe a theropod, but it's so partial it's hard to actually assign it as anything distinct. Now, for people who are fans of Sorophagenax, there is some hope. Most notably that in that one that is kind of indeterminate, if you found more fossils with that kind of structures, specifically accessory laminae, then you could hypothetically go, hey, no, look, we do have it and it is valid, as long as those bones that contain more of that are also attached to the rest of the skeleton. But that's really unlikely to find. But because the holotype is invalid, that means that all the other material from the quarry needs to be re-examined, and it's Allosaurus. The same paper did that examination, and it's Allosaurus with a few different traits to be fair, and it's also larger. So the authors then went with a new name, Allosaurus anax, as a nod to the last part of Sorophagenax. And it's not like they could actually just keep Sorophagenax in there. The holotype's invalid, and you can't just move the name over very casually. You'd have to then mess with a whole bunch of the taxonomy, because there's a bunch of papers that have already referred to Sorophagenax as just those holotype vertebra. So you can't just move the name that easily, unfortunately. I will also state that from personal conversations with Andy, the lead author, he would have saved the name if he could have, but the evidence and the material just wasn't there. Next, we're going to be looking at the forests that started to develop during the Devonian, and first we're going to look at the Middle Devonian Hangingman Sandstone Formation from Devon, literally the namesake of the Devonian. This paper looked at all of the different members, the subsections of the formation, and they made this really comprehensive graphic that actually shows the different depositional environments that would have been present, with the upland floodplains rapidly getting covered by small cladoxylopsid tree ferns. These same tree ferns would have helped hold together the banks where they were strong enough not to be washed away by floods. Meanwhile, in the lowland environments, isolated plant material would be washed down to near-shore environments or collect in deltaic wedges, with fewer trees occupying the more muddy substrate of the downstream areas. But then we have other things from the Devonian, like Alisemenia, which is actually one of the oldest known seeds, and specifically it's the oldest known seed that had wings for dispersal. The seed doesn't actually have a cupule, which normally surrounds the seed, so it's very early in plant evolution. So seemingly at least early in plant evolution on land, dispersal was more important than protection, which makes a lot of sense because there would be relatively few herbivores on the land during the Devonian, if any at all. This is really right when animals were starting to move onto land, so yeah, this makes sense with what we would expect. Anogenesis is a tetrapod that's already known from New South Wales, Australia, and it comes from the late Devonian. This paper looked at different environmental evidence in the Hervey group to understand where exactly it would have been living in that group, because there's a few different environments throughout that rock unit. Overall, there's a lot of plant fossils, at least in certain parts, which help to suggest it was a semi-humid forest. But those are not the majority of the Hervey group, which is otherwise interpreted as having smaller, shrubbier plants, more indicative of dry conditions. The wet conditions, though, actually coincide with an increase in CO2 globally, and those are the sediments that Anogenesis was actually found in. This means that rather than tetrapods evolving in dry conditions and moving from pond to pond, instead it seems like they really started to evolve in forests, and we're using those forests to potentially help escape from predators, but also just when you're thinking of roots and whatnot going through stream systems, having limbs could help them be able to move through those environments easier, even if they're not yet moving onto land. Then again, as you continue, they need to escape predators or find new food sources. then they can actually start moving onto land using that same adaptation. Moving back into dinosaurs though, we're going to be looking at Hypacosaurus, a hadrosaur that's well known from North America. And it actually would have lived alongside another well-known hadrosaur, Maiasaura, which is known from Egg Mountain with a number of large clutches of eggs, and as well as many individuals throughout various stages of their growth. But it seems like Hypacosaurus may not have actually had the same kind of care for its young, at least to the same degree as Maiasaura. And we say this because there's two different sites that are on each side of the border between the United States and Canada. And what they were able to find is that these two herds that actually have a whole bunch of them that seemingly all got buried at once, they're all the same age more or less, which is kind of strange. So one of the sites has a lot of individuals that are about 4 years old, meaning they're still relatively young, subadults to juveniles. Meanwhile, the other site has a mix of different ages. What this means is that likely after initial care for the eggs, Hypacosaurus likely just kind of let the young go and wander as teeny tiny herds with a bunch of small individuals. Those herds would then stay together at least until they started to get up into breeding ages, where they were then able to join the adult herds more easily. And that's why you're getting this kind of broader diversity of ages from one of the sites and not the other. There's also a lot of stuff on tyrannosaurs, such as Tyrannosaurus mecariensis, which is a new species of Tyrannosaurus named last year, and unlike previous attempts to name a new Tyrannosaurus species based on traits like the rotation of the teeth, this one has actual traits that differ more than in just a single species. Unfortunately, the age is really poorly constrained, but it is older than T-Rex and comes from New Mexico. It's at least younger than 73 million years ago, so it could also simply be the oldest T-Rex known, but again, different traits. I think it's most exemplified by the smaller expansion of the dentary bone on the lower jaw, as well as smaller curvature in the prearticular bone and a deep posterior process on the splenial. So seemingly a perfectly valid new species of Tyrannosaurus, and there will probably be larger implications on the biogeography of Tyrannosaurus and the rest of the Tyrannosaurines, and I know there are people working on this, and hopefully that work will be out soon, but gotta wait just a little bit. Nanotyrannis is also maybe back, and there's going to be a lot of back and forth in this between different researchers, but this paper points at various traits along many bones. The issue with this is that they are specimens at very different sizes, so it could be solely down to just ontogenetic change, the change that happens as an animal ages. That said, when coded out phylogenetically, they found Nanotyrannis to be between the Alioramines and the Albertosaurines. And I know of another analysis that has found similar, but there's also other patterns in that study that's being worked on that still bring Nanotyrannis at least somewhat into question. So we'll have to wait till everything's published and received by the scientific community. I will also mention that Dr. Napoli has a new method for identifying taxa in the works, and there's a preprint even. Talking with him at SVP, he has opinions about Nanotyrannis that he has not revealed, but I'm excited to see what they are. There's also been proposed anogenesis in Tyrannosaur line Tyrannosaurines, and what that means is they're suggesting that one of the Daspletosaurus species evolved directly into the next species, into the next species, and then directly into Tyrannosaurus, which there's some questions about that, because anogenesis is really hard to prove in the fossil record. This paper looked at a whole bunch of other specimens though, and that includes new specimens that weren't in the initial analysis, and it finds anogenesis, but not to T-Rex. So what's happening here is they do find that Daspletosaurus likely was an anogenetic species, or species complex at least, meaning that Daspletosaurus horneri evolved into Turosis, evolved into Wilsoni, if Wilsoni is valid, and there is more stuff happening with that as well. Regardless though, they didn't evolve directly into Tyrannosaurus. So basically what this means is that yes, there is maybe anogenesis in certain Tyrannosaur groups, but we need to do that on a specimen by specimen basis as opposed to broader species, because there is variation within different specimens, and that's what some of these newer papers have been doing. So good to see. Hopefully there will be new work on this in the future. And then we have Asiatyrannus, which is a relatively small but large-headed tyrannosaur. The large here meaning that the snout is deeper than long, or at least relative to most other tyrannosaurs, especially the Alioramines, one of which it would have lived alongside, the larger Kinjusaurus. This means that this smaller Asia Tyrannus is actually probably more closely related to Tyrannosaurus rex than to most of the other Asian tyrannosaurs, which is interesting, but also, again, we just need to do a whole lot more work on them because this is not expected to be in this part of Asia, very south in China, just because most of the Tyrannosaurines and things more like Tyrannosaurus rex tend to live more northern or in North America. There was also a look at how large different dinosaurs could have gotten, specifically in Tyrannosaurus rex. Because if you're thinking statistically, you're more likely to find someone my size, because I am dead average height for North America, than someone the size of Andre the Giant. But people could clearly get as large as Andre the Giant. So how large could something like Tyrannosaurus rex get based on statistics? That's all this paper did, and yes, they could be larger. That's not the important part of this paper, though. The important part of this paper is they're using Tyrannosaurus rex as a case study. Hypothetically, for most fossils we have, they could have still ended up much larger than the largest specimens we have. And that's because the fossil record is very incomplete, meaning that it's very unlikely that we're going to find the largest individual of any species to have ever lived. Instead, we're more likely to find a whole bunch of them in the middle of the size bell curve, and then hypothetically there's some extremes that could have been much larger. Going backwards in time, though, we're also looking at the Ordovician, because the Ordovician had a mass extinction at the end of it that was caused by glaciation and cooling, and nobody has been able to explain it until potentially now. And that's because this paper looked at where different craters were formed during the Ordovician, and found that based on where the continents would have been in the Ordovician, they would have mostly been near the equator. So why there? What these authors propose is a large asteroid got close to, but did not contact the Earth. Then the gravitational pull of the Earth and Sun would have pulled the asteroid apart, a distance called the Roche limit. This means the asteroid actually would have been closer than the Moon to the Earth. This asteroid would have been close to the plane of the solar system and likely bumped towards Earth from the asteroid belt. This then created a ring around Earth where, over a few million years, different parts of that ring would fall to the Earth, creating the Ordovician age craters around the equator that we still have today. The shade from the ring also might be the cause of that cooling, because even if it's just a few degrees off, it is going to block out a lot of the sun as long as it's not perfectly in line with the plane of the solar system. So we might have actually solved it, that glaciers were caused because there was just more shade because Earth ended up with a ring for a few million years. But we can go back even further to about 2.3 billion years ago to see potentially the oldest multicellular life ever. And this is from a fossil site in Gabon in the Francevilian Basin. The fossils in this paper have been somewhat questioned, but now they actually have a mechanism for how this could have happened. And it's really specific because it's actually a subduction zone that's also releasing a whole lot of mineral-rich water into the deep sea. But then there's also a lot of erosion happening on the land that's producing a lot of mineral-rich water near the top of the water column. What this then means is, sure, you can get a lot of that stuff from the shallow water column, but a lot of the minerals that you need to become larger are actually deeper. And there have been studies in the past that actually have used yeast where they put a bunch of yeast in the water, they drain off the bottom 10% of that water that has the yeast in it, and kept doing that. So the evolutionary pressure was to sink to the bottom, and the researchers were able to develop, from single-celled yeast, multicellular yeast in a laboratory setting. This is basically what they're proposing happened in Gabon, where, sure, there's all kinds of single-celled life in the shallow parts of the water column, but those organisms that can actually sink down faster and becoming multicellular as part of that could actually take better advantage of the other mineral wealth that was existing because of the different minerals that were being produced by this convergent boundary. And jumping almost all the way to modern day, Homotherium was a saber-toothed cat which ranged from parts of Africa through Eurasia and into North America. And a mummy of a young one was found in Siberia and shows that at least when they were young, they would have had a dark coloration and that they likely did have pronounced lips to cover the saber teeth. This is because, while it was young, it didn't actually have the saber teeth developed yet, but the cub, when compared to a modern-day lion cub, still had longer lips. It also had like a little goatee of fur right at the bottom of its chin, so that's really nice. We can make some really nice reconstructions of these animals now. But it's also not the only mummy that was described that was frozen in parts of Russia, because there was also a 32,000-year-old frozen woolly rhino that was described. This is actually the only known subadult, which combined with already described specimens that are about 1 to 1.5 years old, or just entirely adults, this one would be about 4 years old and really helps to fill in this gap in their growth and ontogeny and helps to show that, yeah, the back did support a fatty hump around a muscle ridge, which was able to help hold up the head because, again, they're like modern rhinos. They have big heads with big horns. They're heavy. But we also have people interacting with fossils, such as in South Africa, where there's a painting from indigenous people that's been called the horned serpent, but it's been really hard to ID, and also it has limbs, so that's not necessarily lining up. It's also been dated to between 1821 and 1835, about 10 years before the first known description of a common group of fossils in South Africa's Karoo Basin where this painting took place. And that's the Dicynodonts, of which Lystrosaurus is incredibly common. The author suggests that this painting of the horned serpent may actually just be a reconstruction of Lystrosaurus, with the horns not being horns, but rather the tusks that Lystrosaurus would have bore in life. It's also really interesting because in modern African ecosystems, there's not really anything with really prominent downward-facing tusks. So yeah, there's plenty of Lystrosaurus fossils around, and potentially this is some of the first paleo art of Lystrosaurus, if not the first. The local San people also have a belief in a large extinct animal, or at least an animal which they haven't seen. This means potentially, again, this might be some of the first paleo art of Lystrosaurus. I could also see people arguing that it's a snake, with the limbs being a genetic mutation from something like a python, which do have spurs on occasion, and this could just be a more pronounced version of that. However, there's plenty of reasons to think that, yeah, no, like this is just an actual Lystrosaurus painting. It's a reconstruction of an extinct animal by the indigenous people of the area. But it's not just in South Africa where the indigenous population is actually providing fossil information. In a more whimsically titled paper, this one was trying to do what it said in the title: when did the moa go extinct? The idea is that humans killed them when the Maori first arrived and they were extinct by about 1450 CE. A dataset of alleged sightings was used as a framework, and they dated from 1675 to 1993, which is only 30 years ago, and also my birthday's then, so I'm getting older too. But really importantly, these sightings were also compared with the Thylacine in Australia, which had a larger area to exist over and was documented well into the modern day and into the Industrial Revolution. What they found based on modern accounts of the Thylacine not being accurate and the historical record of moa sightings is that at best they went extinct by 1770 or so. But also they would have had a sharp drop-off by 1408, to a degree where a population was never going to be sustainable and be able to come back. There's also a whole lot of work done on plant and insect interactions in the fossil record. And this one's really interesting, at least the first one is, because people aren't the first farmers, ants are. And specifically leafcutter ants, which were taking the leaves not as food, but as a substrate to grow fungus on. This paper looked at the genetics of both the fungus and the ants to try and identify times where they actually would have diverged from other species. And the cladograms are pretty messy. However, it appears as though this may have evolved separately in multiple groups, and in general, right around the KPG extinction. So essentially, whatever leaves were around may have actually helped provide a substrate for fungus after that extinction, and then the ants were capitalizing on that. So basically, during the extinction, food hoarding was selected for, so they were hauling all kinds of leaves and other detritus in. Fungus started to grow on that, and then it happened to just grow really well on the leaves, so ants were picking more leaves because it still got them more food. And the fungi were content with that because that was a great place to grow where they were protected by all of these ants. So it's a symbiotic relationship that seemingly developed very quickly. There's also the El Chango Lagerstadt in Mexico, and this would have been during the Angiosperm terrestrial revolution, meaning angiosperms, flowering plants, as opposed to things like conifers, were really starting to diversify a ton. This paper looked at the kinds of damage on the plants that was brought about by insects, and there's a lot of different kinds of things that are actually happening. And there was more feeding done on the angiosperms, despite them not being preserved nearly as often in the environment. What this means is that the insects that were around were more selectively feeding on the angiosperms, which, again, if they're supposed to be diversifying but they're mostly being eaten, what does that mean? Basically, what it means is, A, we need some more research, but also, really importantly, some of what's happening is essentially that, sure, these angiosperms are diversifying, but those insects that are eating those leaves, maybe they're also spreading seeds or pollen. It's one of those things that we need to do a lot more work on to really understand how exactly the angiosperm terrestrial revolution really took place. There was also a paper looking at a Carboniferous Lagerstätte of the Wamsuta Formation of Massachusetts, and it found that it actually helps to fill in gaps of diverse alluvial fan systems, which would have been eroding off of the early Appalachian Mountains. It's an impression Lagerstätte, which means instead of body fossils, it's mostly traces, but sometimes these traces are very well preserved, to the point where you can see the entire bodies of some kinds of arthropods preserved in the mud. There's also interactions between insects and plants that are discussed, including the oldest evidence of insects laying eggs in or on fossil plant taxa. Now, this paper is really just kind of doing an initial description of the site, and there's going to be more on this, but it's really exciting that we can actually start seeing how some of these behaviors that we take for granted in the modern day actually have really old origins. Eucalyptus is known for forming large forests in Australia. However, its fossil history dates back even further, at least as far back as the Eocene, where their preservation is fantastic in the Eocene Laguna del Junco locality in Argentina. A review of eucalyptus fossils from the locality found 28 types of insect damage, with some being piercing from insects, some being gall formation, which is a swelling of the plant normally caused by some sort of damage, often insects and their feeding, and all of the varieties of that insect damage are also found in modern-day Australian eucalyptus, suggesting that there is some level of long-standing plant-insect relationships within eucalyptus. Beetles are the most speciose group on Earth, with many thousands of species known, and probably many, many more thousands that are unknown. A review of beetle fossils found that pre-Permian Triassic mass extinction groups were mostly associated with dead trees and feeding on dead trees. Considering the mass extinction at the end of the Permian, that might have actually been one of the traits that allowed them to make it through that mass extinction, which is the only mass extinction to significantly impact insects. Beetles associated with wood, though, did die out overall, so there's a little bit of a conflicting concept happening here, where we're not entirely sure. A few groups, though, obviously did make it through and diversified in the Triassic and early Jurassic, but it seems like their main burst in diversity was associated with one thing, the angiosperms. So, seems like, yeah, the angiosperm terrestrial revolution was really important as a factor for why we have so many beetle species today. Additionally, their close association with those plants led to horizontal gene transfer from fungi and bacteria that also would help to decay different parts of plants. What that means is the genes existed in the fungi and bacteria, and they horizontally shifted and became just integral to the genome of certain types of beetles, meaning that they could then also use those genes to more efficiently use plants as a food source. And finally, we're going to be looking at auctions, which is kind of tragic. There's the private sale of fossils that happened this year, and there's quite a few of them, including Stegosaurus, which is currently loaned at a museum, but could be taken by the owner at any time. It's also the most complete Stegosaurus fossil known, so losing it would be awful for our understanding of the genus. It also sold for a whole lot at $44.6 million to a hedge fund billionaire. There were still more sales, though, including a $6 million sale of an Hypacosaurus, the largest dinosaur to have ever been auctioned. A pair of Allosaurus, along with another less complete Stegosaurus, also reached $15.7 million for auction total. So there's tons of ethics questions and whatnot, and I'm not going to jump into all of them, but there's also been a lot of these things that have actually used AI slop for many of the reconstructions because it's cheap, even if it's wildly inaccurate. And it's frustrating to see AI become so prominent in many areas, simply because it's giving people a really false impression of the dinosaurs, which that's misinformation that paleontologists then need to correct, instead of actually just being able to do their jobs in their research. This misinformation speaks to the fandomization of paleontology. most obviously pointed out this year by failure of certain parts of the online paleo community to understand the Sorophagenax paper and the reasons behind its conclusions, and how science is actually really systemic and how we actually keep everything organized, from testing hypotheses to peer review. Publishing is hard, and so being able to get out a paper that is going to upset some people, like making Sorophagenax not valid anymore, is good, but also, again, it takes a lot of effort to be able to make a paper like that and get it published with very good conclusions and evidence, because you always want to be thinking about anything that might prove you wrong. Insulting researchers online because a fan favorite dinosaur isn't valid shows no care about the practice of paleontology, but only the idea of it. And with the way things are currently going in the US, and with other nations having resurgent defunding of the sciences, this is going to be an ongoing concern. Other research from this year found links between being against vaccination and also not believing in evolution, between not believing in evolution and not believing in climate change, so fundamentally just not believing in things that are issues that need to be addressed. If paleontologists need to go out of their way to explain the process of science, to explain why AI art isn't creating accurate depictions of fossil organisms, or to explain how evolution is actually real and we have really solid evidence for it, things which should all be taught through very basic schooling, then we risk the health of those that we care about to another pandemic, and we risk the lives of millions who could be adversely affected by climate change. These are real issues that we need to address. It is my hope that with this channel I am helping people find better love for the science and help people really understand how much work goes into these different papers. There's a reason why I go, hey, this paper came out, and then a few months later I'll go, hey, this paper says something different, because that's how science works. It's a dialogue between different people. Also, I was talking with one of my colleagues, and I don't remember why, but in my section here, it says if you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen, and then Flavor Town. I think that's largely just about, understand that if you're going to try and critique someone's published papers, you should be coming from a point of specific critiques of it, not just, I don't like it. And if people are telling you that it's silly because you just don't like it, that's perfectly reasonable for them to do. And if you don't like it, that they're telling you that, take a step back. Look at the paper in more detail. Because again, the fandomization of paleontology has just been kind of horrible. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. This year in review obviously is getting out quite a bit later. We've had a lot going on with the family and whatnot. I appreciate everyone who did, come here and watch it, even though it's been 6 months since the start of the new year. Also, there was stuff that I was talking about that I was hinting at future work, and that future work has also come out, and I have videos on it already. So yeah, thank you for staying patient with us during this process where we're trying to get a lot done. Children also are existing and doing things, so, trying to raise a family and all that, so not always perfect amount of timing for getting Raptor Chatter stuff done, especially with the research stuff that's been going on, and at least a lot of that's submitted now, so should be cutting down on a lot of the time. With that said, everyone be safe, take care, don't go extinct.